Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lee McIntyre. He's a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He is interested in comparative methodology across the natural and social sciences, and is the author of books like Post-Truth and the one we're going to focus on the most today, The Scientific Attitude Defending Science from Denial, Fraud, and Pseudoscience. So, Dr. McIntyre, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Okay, so we're going to talk about philosophy of science today. I've already had some philosophers of science on the show, and one of the topics that people talk a lot about in philosophy of science is the problem of demarcation or the demarcation problem. So, could you tell us what it is and basically when people first talked or mentioned this problem or realized that maybe this problem existed?
hmm Yeah, the problem of demarcation is really the founding of the philosophy of science. It's the original problem that nobody has still solved. Philosophy of science has been its own separate field from epistemology for about the last 120 years, something like that. And I guess you could say that people noticed the problem of demarcation even before the field was founded, which is maybe why it became founded. You could really trace it back to David Hume. David Hume had something that they called Hume's fork, where at one point in the treatise he says that if there's something that, I can't remember the exact quotation, but he says that if there's something that doesn't have any empirical backing to it, it doesn't have any quantitative measure, no mathematical backing, then commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Well, that's a demarcation problem. He's trying to figure out what's worth paying attention to and what's not. And so this was really the beginning of the philosophy of science, trying to figure out what was science and what was not science. So they're looking for a criteria of demarcation between science and non-science, and most specifically between science and pseudoscience, the fields that were pretending to be sciences but were really not. And this got worked out through the logical positivists and Karl Popper and everybody since who's been trying to solve this problem.
But it hasn't been solved yet, right?
No, and the problem, I'm not sure it can be solved. A few years back, a few decades back now, Larry Loudon, who's a very prominent philosopher of science, wrote a paper on the demise of the demarcation problem. And he basically argued that the demarcation problem was dead, that it couldn't be solved, because if you think about it, what you would have to do to solve the demarcation problem is you would have to have a perfect criteria, something that identified all and only science, which is to say that it never made a mistake, okay? The best analogy here that I can think of, the one that I use when I teach the demarcation problem to my students, is something in wartime, I guess outside it too, signal detection theory. Suppose you were a spotter for enemy aircraft and you wanted to shoot down enemy aircraft, but you didn't want to shoot down any friendly aircraft, okay? So one thing that you could do to make sure that no enemy aircraft ever got overhead is just shoot down all the planes. But then, of course, you'd shoot down friendly planes. One way to not shoot down any friendly planes is just to let any plane go over. But then, of course, some enemy aircraft would get over. So what you need in signal detection theory is a way to tell perfectly what are the enemy aircraft and what are the friendly aircraft, and shoot down all and only the enemy aircraft. That's a very difficult thing to do in the parlance in philosophy of science. You need a perfect set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what is science and what is not. And Loudon makes the argument that this problem cannot be solved. He's gotten pushback. Massimo Pigliucci and some other folks who came along later and said, no, there is a way to solve this. I got interested. I mean, everybody in philosophy of science is interested in this problem. There will be a great reward for whoever can solve this problem. I got interested in this problem because it seemed to me that if we can't solve it after 100 years, maybe Loudon's right, but there's a worse issue here. And the issue is that if we're taking this long to solve it, what happens in the meantime? All of the pseudoscientists, all of the science deniers can basically say, well, you don't even know what science is. You don't even have a good criteria of demarcation. So how do you know that, dowsing and witchcraft are not science? How can you rule out mythology? How can you say that flat Earth, isn't good science? You don't have any way without a perfect criteria of demarcation to push back on things that are not science. And so I got interested in whether there was a way to do that without solving the problem of demarcation. That is, without that, suppose Loudon's right. It can't be solved in the sense of come up with a perfect set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Can you still find what's special about science and use that to push back against the science deniers and the pseudoscientists? Because that's the heart of the problem.
Yeah, and can we do it without solving the demarcation problem?
That's the hardest thing. Because, I mean, if the demarcation problem is a logical problem, if you think about it, I mean, if you think about what the logical positivists tried to do, you think about what Karl Popper tried to do. They tried to solve the problem or dissolve it, I guess, if you look at Karl Popper, on logical grounds. But in practice, it really ends up being something quite different, because I mean, if you had a great logical criteria, that would be terrific, and you could use that. But absent that, either because it doesn't exist or because we can't find it, we need something in the meantime to use when people ask us, okay, well then what's so great about science? Why is it special? What's the difference between science and non-science in a practical way, so that you're not having to deal with all the things that are pretending to be science but are not science. That's really the motivation for the problem of demarcation. How can you bar the door against the people who are pretending to be scientists who are really not scientists?
So in trying to solve the demarcation problem, should we distinguish between pseudoscience and anti-science? I mean, between something that resembles science but is not, and something that is overtly against science?
It's a great question, because I think that you've put your finger on an ambiguity in the field. If you look at the original literature, sometimes, if you look even at Karl Popper, whose name is so prominent in this area, he equivocates, and so does Larry Loudon, and so do the logical positivists. What are they trying to do? Are they trying to demarcate science from pseudoscience, science from non-science, or science from something else? If you go back in Karl Popper's work, he doesn't use the word pseudoscience early on, but then and there's a scholarly issue that I think I deal with in a footnote in the book, but isn't it amazing, that people hadn't noticed this, but it is a bit of a scandal, because there is a distinction. There's a different demarcation problem, if you will, between non-science and pseudoscience, because if something's non-science, that's not necessarily an embarrassment. Maybe it's not non-science because it's not trying to be science. It's not pretending to be scientific. But then you've got pseudoscience, which are fields that are pretending to be scientific, fields that are not actually following the dictates of good scientific thought. And there's a difference there, right? Because the one that you really worry about, the one that I think philosophers should worry about, is pseudoscience. Demarcating between science and non-science, you can do that. I mean, you could, that's an interesting part of the problem. But the real nub of the problem is the problem of pseudoscience, because those are the dangerous ones. Those are the ones who say, well, why aren't you studying whether Bigfoot exists? Why aren't you studying whether there have been alien abductions? Why aren't you spending more time on the hypothesis that the Earth is flat, or the creation myth? These are pseudosciences. But unless we can say specifically what's pseudo about them, we really, we're going to have a hard time. Non-science, I'm not so afraid of. I mean, there have been debates, is philosophy supposed to be more scientific? Well, some people think it is, some people think it isn't. They want to make a science of ethics, say. And we can have reasonable debates about those sorts of things. But for the most part, I think of non-science as being fields like art and literature that are not trying to be scientific, and there's no embarrassment in that. They're not, they're interested in truth and reality at a certain level, but they're not interested in empirical data in the same way that the scientist is. Now, I'm going to get myself in trouble here with my friends in the humanities, but and I can say a little bit more about that if you want. But it seems to me that there are some things that are true that are not empirically something that you can investigate empirically, and the study of those are non-sciences.
Yeah, and I mean that last part, it's interesting because I wanted to ask you, doesn't the question of what is knowledge come to the table here as well? Because I mean, we are trying to establish, I guess, through philosophy, science, and other areas of knowledge, what is true. But I mean, if we have a scientistic attitude, then perhaps
Yeah.
we think that only science can give truthful answers about what is out there or whatever question it is.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to look at it, because it's very easy to assume that all truth is scientific truth.
Mhm.
And that's scientism. That's when you think that the methods of science are the only way to discover, truth and reality. But I think that there has to be a distinction here, because scientific knowledge is privileged, it's special through its test procedures, through its community standards of checking one another's work. And this is why I'm so fascinated by science. But I'm willing to say, and I think many philosophers would agree with me, that there's more to knowledge than that. And we're not talking here necessarily about pseudoscience. We're talking, and we're not even necessarily talking about verification procedures. We're talking about things that are true that may not be verifiable. In fact, things that may be true that we can't even gather data about, that it's tough there's a difference between something being true and knowing it's true, or being certain that it's true. I'll give you an example. Something happens to us after we die. There is a truth about what happens to us after we die, but there are no data. Nobody has ever come back from being dead to tell us what it's like. Now, there are near-death experiences, but near-death is not the same as death. Well, okay, but there are allegedly cases of people who have died and then come back. Those are a little closer. Those are more interesting, because, but then there's the question that arises: is that a science? Is that empirical data? And here's the problem: it's first-person data. It can't be verified by anybody other than the person who had the experience. So how do you know? And then that all gets intertwined with maybe their religious beliefs or what they want to be true, etc. So how do you have a science of that? So here we've got an example of something that there is an answer to this. And we will all know someday when we die what happened, or not, depending on what the answer is, what happens to us after we die. But this cannot be a science because there are no data. It's not empirically possible to study it. And now, is it possible to have knowledge of it? Is it possible to know before you die what happens after you die? I know people who have had experiences where they claim to have died and came back and claim that you can know, that they know. One of them was A.J. Ayer. Now, I didn't know him personally, but I mean, A.J. Ayer is a great example in the history of philosophy of somebody who is as hard-nosed and empiricist as possible. He wrote Language, Truth, and Logic. He was one of the original logical positivists. If there was anybody who believed in the problem of demarcation and, Hume's fork, get rid of it because it's sophistry and illusion, it's A.J. Ayer. But one day he was eating his lunch and he choked on a fishbone and he died. And during his death, he had an experience that he describes that I'll leave it to the listener to go out and look at it. It's really amazing. And his wife even claimed that he had a personality change. She said that, Freddie was so much nicer after he was dead. Well, so he didn't die and that was it. He came back and it changed him. So there's a great example of something that there's a right and wrong answer, but it is not accessible by empirical means, because if anybody would have done it, it would have been A.J. Ayer. Now, I think that he later in life sort of gave up some of the mystical insights that he had during the time that he had died, but it is a very fascinating moment in the history of epistemology, and I recommend that folks look for this on the internet somewhere, is this story, and especially the quotation from his wife. It's really quite amazing.
Yeah, so we've been talking about what is science and the demarcation problem, how important it is to distinguish science from pseudoscience, but is there one single scientific method that apply across all scientific disciplines?
I think not. I don't think that there's any such thing as scientific method, and I think that quite a number of philosophers of science agree with that. We were all taught in school when we learned science that there is a scientific method. It's observe, test, predict, observe, form a hypothesis, predict, test, and then revise your theory. But if you look at the history of science, they do all those things, but they don't do them in a recipe. They don't do them in such a way that you could say that the quote-unquote scientific method is the way to distinguish between science and pseudoscience or science and non-science. Karl Popper is a great example of somebody who, I think he has a paper called Why There Is No Scientific Method. And even in Conjectures and Refutations, he talks about the idea that he would teach his students why there couldn't be a scientific method, because he would say, okay, observe. And they would say, observe what? Well, that's the problem. There is a sense, and Thomas Kuhn showed this, there is a sense in which observation itself is theory-laden. You don't just observe the world and then notice a pattern. You come to your observations with certain expectations and certain patterns, some of which are, given to you by, cognitive bias or, just in virtue of being a human. We're prepared when we come to the world and see things. So finding patterns, testing, these are all really important parts of science. But I don't think that there is a quote unquote scientific method. And I have a moment in my book, The Scientific Attitude, where I say, if there's one thing that people believe about science, it's that there's scientific method. If there's one thing that philosophers of science doubt, it's that there's a scientific method. So I think I'm in good company here. I think that there are an awful lot of philosophers of science who really don't believe in scientific method. And it's always shocking for lay people to find this out.
Yeah. And is science value laden?
I Is it value laden? I think it has to be. I think it is. I mean, this goes back to the logical positivist. There's a, it's supposed to be a bad thing to not have a sharp distinction between facts and values. Science is supposed to be objective. Scientists are not supposed to bring their own prejudices, their own wishes for which theory is true and false to the empirical study of reality. But that is impossible. As I said, we all have cognitive biases. Now, it is a good thing to keep those biases down as far as you can. And I'll say this, there's nothing that's more motivating for a scientist to try to be objective than the idea that their colleagues are going to check up on them and make them look foolish if they're not. But the objectivity question really isn't a matter of just of scientists keeping themselves honest. They try to keep one another honest. And this is some really path-breaking work by Helen Longino here, who set out, I think her book is called Science is Social Knowledge. I'm not sure the exact title, but I've got it on the shelf here behind me, I could check. It's a terrific book, and she's a very intellectually honest person. She says that she started out to attack the objectivity of science, understanding that it was shot through with values, but she ended up defending the objectivity of science. It's just that we didn't really understand what science was. Science can have values and yet be more objective than other ways of knowing. And what I found fascinating, and this really motivated some of my work, was this idea that what made science objective to the extent that it is the sense in which it's based on community standards. It's based on scientists checking one another's work. And that was really that and Karl Popper were really the impetus for me to think about what I thought really was distinctive about science, which wasn't scientific method, it was the scientific attitude. Because if you have the right attitude toward doing science, then you can, that in and of itself is a value, right? That in and of itself, to say, I define the scientific attitude as the idea that scientists care about evidence, and they're willing to change their mind based on new evidence. That's a value. That's an attitude. That's a creed, a way of proceeding to study reality. And yet the beauty of that is that it allows scientists who believe in that creed to keep one another honest. So the scientific attitude isn't just, I as an individual scientist have this scientific attitude. It's that it's a community ethos that we use to check one another. So I expanded a little bit too far maybe on the answer, but maybe anticipated where we were going with this. But I think, yes, value. I'm not embarrassed by the fact that there are values in science.
Mm-hmm. How do you look at the relationship between science and skepticism? Because, people who call themselves skeptics usually associate themselves with science and scientists, and some of them say they are also scientists. So what do you think about that?
Skepticism is at the heart of science. Scientists, Carl Sagan said that scientists are walking that narrow line between openness and skepticism. They have to be open to new ideas, but doubtful that they're true until they've been tested. Skepticism is and skepticism, I think, there's philosophical skepticism, Cartesian skepticism, Pyrrhonian skepticism. Scientific skepticism is when you are, comes after that. You're not, the Cartesian skepticism, you're doubting maybe that your senses are accurate. Scientific skepticism is more that you get scientific data, you get sensory data, and you, under normal circumstances, assume that it's accurate, that it's veridical. But it leads you to believe that certain things are true about the world, but you're not sure that they're true. You're not sure that your hypothesis is true until you've gathered more data and you've tested it against the evidence. You've made, as we said with scientific method, you predict and you see if it's true. Okay. So I don't want, so skepticism is at the foundation of science. But if you go out into the world and you talk with science deniers, they will tell you that they are skeptics, and they're not. Right. So nobody wants to self-identify as a denier. Everybody calls themselves skeptics. Whether they're a scientist or a science denier, they want to call themselves skeptic. But I don't think that science deniers are entitled to call themselves skeptics because they're not using skepticism in the way that a scientist is. Scientific skepticism, as I said, with the scientific attitude, means that you're open to new ideas, but you have to be willing to change your mind based on new data, which means that in some sense, if you were a complete skeptic, you'd never believe anything. Scientific skepticism means that, yeah, you're skeptical at first until the data are sufficient. There's enough warrant to justify the belief that that the hypothesis is true. Now, even then, you still have to hold out for the idea that it might not be true. Look at the transition from Newton to Einstein, right? So there's something in philosophy of science called the doctrine of fallibilism. You have to believe that because there's no such thing as proof or certainty with inductive knowledge, that you could be wrong. You could be disproven someday. So, and that too is part of skepticism, right? That you give warrant to the theory. If the theory has warrant, it's worthy of belief, but you always hold out the possibility that you could be wrong. That's a very important part of scientific skepticism.
Mm-hmm. But should scientists be open to all sorts of ideas? I mean, aren't there questions that are not valid in science?
Yeah, and this is that fine line that Sagan was talking about. He said that you have to be open-minded, but not so open that your brains fall out. Okay, so scientists have to be open to the investigation of ideas for which there are some data. Anybody can make up a hypothesis. That doesn't mean that it's worthy of scientific inquiry. It has to be something that has some degree of warrant, some reason to think that it might be true. We're not willing to say that we believe it to be true until we can test it. But if something is just a rank hypothesis that somebody thought of, maybe there's alien life, maybe the world is flat. These are not scientific hypotheses, unless there are data. Now, those are good examples of people, flat earthers, who call themselves skeptics, who don't believe that the scientific data coming out of NASA or Newton or Aristarchus or anybody. That's a perversion of skepticism. Okay, so I think that there's a sense in which Sagan is right. You have to walk that line between being open to new ideas but skeptical until they've got enough data. And the problem with science deniers and the problem with pseudoscientists is they call themselves skeptics, but they're actually quite gullible. They're actually, it's not just that they're not believing the things for which there are data. They're just jumping headlong into believing things for which there are no data whatsoever. And then they say, well, it might be true, but that's not the point, right? So many times a science denier will glom onto the idea of scientific uncertainty. Well, have you proven climate change? Well, let's wait for the crucial experiment. Can you prove that the Earth is a round or oblate spheroid or whatever it is? Can you prove it? Science doesn't work that way. It's not deductive logic. There's always some uncertainty, and scientists have to embrace that. That's what's so great about science. It's why it's able to learn from new evidence. Science deniers don't get that. Science deniers tend to want proof for the things they don't want to believe. And they really don't need any evidence whatsoever, the things that they do want to believe. So it's this double standard around evidence that they really get wrong. And that's what I think special about science, that they're working both sides of that equation, trying to get that line just right.
Mm-hmm. So when science goes wrong and we have cases of fraud, for example, can we learn something about science by studying those cases?
I think so. It's really an interesting question that goes back to the demarcation problem, if you want to tell the truth, because if you read Karl Popper, an awful lot of the cases where people are interested in what's special about science, they're talking about the successes of science. Mm-hmm. They're very interested in, those moments of the success of science where everything worked as it should. I think you can learn an awful lot about science, what it is and what it isn't, by looking at its failures, well-intentioned failures, mistakes, but also fraud. Because, I've got a whole chapter on fraud, because I think that fraud is one of the most telling examples of why it's so important to talk about the scientific attitude. Because if you think about it, fraud is the direct opposite of the scientific attitude. These are people who have promised, who have pledged through their work to be honest, to share their data with their colleagues, not to cheat, not to make up data, to try to be open-minded but skeptical at the same time, to believe the creed that other scientists believe. And science couldn't work without that. I mean, if everybody cheated, or even if most people cheated, even if 10% of them cheated, science would come to a crashing halt. So science is really dependent on people believing this, this creed, I think, of the scientific attitude. And that's what's so terrible about fraud. Because fraud is when you have somebody who promises to follow that, and then they cheat. That's the betrayal. Some people say that there should be no such thing as heresy in science, that because anything should be subject to test. I think that's the one form of heresy in science, which is fraud. When somebody pretends to be a scientist, and maybe they are a scientist, maybe they've got the background, they've got the training, but then they cheat. Because what a waste of resources, what a betrayal of their commitment and of their colleagues who, then go and do the work. Outright mistakes are not necessarily a problem. They can lead to a dead end. It can be, it can lead to field astray for decades sometimes. But we learn something from mistakes. Fraud, I'm not sure there's an upside to it. I mean, there's an upside to analyzing what fraud is, because I think it helps you understand what's so special about this creed of science that I've called the scientific attitude. So I think that it's important for philosophers of science to study fraud, and I'm not the only one who's done it. There's a lot of work on fraud. But I think that there's got to be a distinction between fraud and failure. Okay, there's got to be a distinction between the people who, in a well-intentioned way, made a mistake, and the people who intentionally cheat.
Mhm. And these mistakes that you're talking about, not the fraudulent ones, let's say, but the honest, uh, would you say that they are part of how science works? Because I would imagine that, for example, perhaps we could consider an hypothesis being invalidated by the evidence being a mistake, but that's part of how science normally works, right?
I think that's true. I mean, that goes back to Karl Popper. That was his core idea, that science was a process of falsification. Science was a process of finding hypotheses that were refuted by the evidence, and that this was the way that science learns. And I think there's a lot to that. I mean, you can't prove a hypothesis true, but you can disprove it. And what does that allow you to do? It allows you to move on to a different hypothesis. Everybody's looking for that crucial experiment. Everybody, and Kuhn talks about this, everybody's looking for that. You know, suppose there are two theories and you don't know which one is true, and you know they want that crucial experiment to demarcate, to differentiate between the two theories and say this one's true and this one's not. Okay, that's very hard to find. Yet I think it's accurate to say that science works through finding out things that are not true, through always looking for that flaw. That in and of itself is a really interesting thing about science. Scientists are not looking for evidence that their theories are true. They're looking for evidence that their theories are not true. I think that Popper really nailed that. There's something in cognitive science called confirmation bias. And if you look at what science deniers do, they're always looking for, you talk to flat earthers, they're always looking for something to try to make it sound like their theory is true. That's not the scientific attitude. The scientific attitude is being open to new data that would show your theory is false. And when it happens, then you move on to a different hypothesis. So
Right.
I think you're right about learning something. Stuart Firestein wrote an absolutely path-breaking book called Failure. Where he made and he's an eminent biologist, you know, scientist himself. He made the argument that we learn from failure, and I agree. We learn from failure. We don't learn from fraud.
Right.
Fraud is, and fraud can be the basis for science denial. Look at what happened with the hypothesis that the MMR vaccine causes autism. That work was debunked a long time ago, but people still believe it. People still, it's one of the central pillars of anti-vax these days, the science denial. Well, even after there were problems with the original experiment, and it was revealed of all the sloppiness and the mistakes that Andrew Wakefield made in that experiment, how small the sample size was, where he got the patients from, et cetera. I mean, there were so many errors, enough to debunk it. It then came out that it was fraud. It then came out that he knew that he was doing the wrong thing, that he fudged not only all of the sloppiness and the mistakes which happen in science and, can get a paper retracted, which is what happened to him. After it came out that it was not only that, it was fraud. He had intentionally falsified the data. And yet, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world who still believe that he was correct. Fraud is dangerous. Mistakes are inevitable. We learn from them and we move on. But fraud is dangerous.
hmm What about the case of social science? Because there are people that even question if social science is real science. What is your position on that?
You bring up something that's near and dear to my heart because my first work in the philosophy of science was on the philosophy of social science. And I was interested in why the natural sciences were so much more successful than the social sciences and what the social sciences needed to do to become more scientific. And in my earlier work, I guess I was trying to push back against arguments that social science couldn't be more scientific because I thought that it could be. And I was very interested in methodological reasons why the social sciences could be more scientific. I ultimately came to realize, as I did my later work on the scientific attitude, that that's what was missing. That one reason that the social sciences do, have not been as successful as the natural sciences is because some of the people who are doing social science are not emulating this attitude of changing your hypothesis based on the evidence. The danger, just to be blunt about it, the danger in the social sciences, I think, is ideology. And more than that, it's political ideology. It's when people already know what they want to be true before they start the experiment. Why is it that there are social scientific studies which show that immigrants are a net drag on the American economy, and other studies which show that immigrants are a net benefit for the American economy? How is that possible? We wouldn't tolerate that in the natural sciences. There would be some sort of a study to differentiate this question. But what happens is that so much social scientific research is done by partisans. And this is not just all in universities. I'm not claiming necessarily bad faith amongst my academic colleagues. I'm saying that if you look at some of the research centers, some of the think tanks, they do their own social science research, and a lot of it is advocacy research. We wouldn't go to the American Tobacco Institute for an objective study on whether or not smoking caused lung cancer, okay? And yet, people go to think tanks, partisan think tanks, or partisan scholars for studies which back up their beliefs on immigration, on gun control, on the death penalty, on myriad questions in sociology and such. Now, that's not to say that there cannot be good social scientific work done, and there is excellent social scientific work done, and I try to highlight some of that in my book. But I think that to the extent that there isn't good social scientific work, it's number one, because the social sciences are very hard. You can't even get people to be objective about vaccines or the shape of the earth. How are you going to get them to be objective about things that they feel like they have first person access to because they're a human being? So the social sciences are it's much harder to study human behavior than to study natural phenomena, just in virtue of that. But it's also because I think that people go into it not recognizing that the scientific attitude is what they need to emulate. That's why I'm so excited. That's why I called the book The Scientific Attitude, because I think that it can help you to fight back against denial, fraud, and pseudoscience, and that it can also help you to reform the social sciences. The example here I use in the book, I've got a whole chapter on medicine. Medicine was shot through with subjectivity and values and hunches and people who did not have the scientific attitude. But within a couple of generations, it became more scientific. And I think that's because they started to emulate the idea that evidence matters, and that this idea of just believing what you wanted to believe wasn't helping anybody. We still have not gotten rid of that idea in the social sciences. I love the social sciences. It is a heartbreak for me that the social sciences are not better than they are, because I think they are the key to living in a more just and peaceful world. We need to apply the same scientific standards to studying our own behavior as we do to nature. During my own career, as I was working to try to make the social sciences more scientific, people started to attack the natural sciences. And then people started to attack facts and reality in general. So I've never quite gotten back to the social sciences, but it was my first love in the philosophy of science.
Yeah, and since you say that political ideology can be a problem in the practice of science and more specifically social science, how do you look at the relationship between science and politics? Would you say that science should be apolitical?
Um, it's hard because there are values, as we've said, in science. I mean, look at the example of medicine.
Yeah.
Um, Medicine should not be, there's an easy sense in which you can say, well, medicine should not be political. It shouldn't make a difference what somebody's politics are, whether you test the medicine on them, whether it works on them. It just shouldn't be part of it. And yet, there are all sorts of examples these days with the pandemic of differential death rates based on social class, on ethnicity, people who are underserved by medicine. And we need to study that. We need to figure out why that's the case. So I think I think it would be wrong to claim that medicine should be indifferent to the values that make us want to say that health is better than disease and life is better than death. And that, I think it's another value of medicine that equal access to treatment, it should be important. Should somebody who's rich be able to buy the vaccine and somebody who's poor should just die? Should that be part of medicine? Should that be part of the study, at least of the ethics of medicine? Absolutely, I think so. So politics, to pretend that those questions don't come up, to pretend that there are no values to medicine or the social sciences or even the natural sciences, is I think is to pretend something that's not true. That is not an excuse for letting our cognitive bias run rampant. That's not an excuse for saying, well, since all science is subjective, let's not even try. Let's not even attempt to see if our hypothesis is wrong. Let's not test it. Again, you've got to walk that careful line. But I think here my heart goes out. I think here to the people in Flint, Michigan, the water crisis. I don't know how much you've heard about this, but they were
Yeah, a bit. I've heard a bit, yeah.
The people who live in Flint, Michigan were betrayed by their local government, who was not following the science. So it's easy to lay the blame for the Flint water crisis, where people were drinking contaminated water and children were being exposed to lead in the water for years. And the horrific consequences of that. It's easy to lay that at the feet of the politicians. But I think that there's something else at work here. Some people have made the claim that there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as objectivity. It's all a question of values. There's some people have claimed that science is itself corrupt, that science is political, that there's no objective knowledge. That attitude, that kind of an attack on science, I think that too is part of the problem for the folks in Flint, Michigan. The folks in Flint, Michigan understand that there is a truth, there is a reality about whether or not they're drinking contaminated water. Pretending that, understanding that science can't be completely objective, or that there are values in science, is not an excuse not even to try. We have to do a better job than we've done. And I think that science is part of how we make the world better. So, when people attack science, when people claim that, well, scientists are not as great as they think they are. They're not, they're just human beings. They have the same biases as everybody else. It's not special knowledge. I push back against that. I react against that, because while there may be some truth to those remarks, what I admire most about science is its aspiration to be as objective and to follow the evidence. And I think that's how you make the world better. That's what the people in Flint, Michigan need. They need somebody who cared about them enough to follow the science and to believe in the science and to do good science.
Mhm. So one final question, and I think this is related to the is-ought dichotomy or the is-ought gap. We've already said here that science is value-laden, but can it be prescriptive, or is it simply descriptive?
Boy, that is such a hard question. You saved the hardest one for last, didn't you? I mean, we don't even know in ethics. I teach ethics. We're still debating the is-ought gap in ethics. If something turns out to be true as a matter of empirical reality, does that mean that it ought to be that way? I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I should have something more to say about that as a philosopher. But to me, it's one of the great unanswered conundrums in the study of philosophy, ethics, science. Because, suppose you found out that there were certain facts about the way that human beings were wired up from birth, about our attitude toward cruelty or selfishness, or something. Would that change morality? I'm not sure that it should, because I think about it this way. Suppose we're all born with the starter set, or the potentiality to understand that if evolution is true, it's probably in my survival interest to kill my enemy when nobody's looking. Okay? That doesn't mean that it's moral to do that. And we're all raised to believe, if we're raised well, to believe that we shouldn't do that. So just because there's a fact of, how maybe our predisposition is, it doesn't make it right. I raise dogs. I enjoy dogs. Is there a morality for dogs? Dogs have prey drive. My dogs have prey drive. Does that mean that it's right? Should they be ashamed? Are they doing the wrong thing if they chase a rabbit or a squirrel? Well, it's their nature. It's not in their control. Now, I can train them not to do that. I can't train them not to want to do that. Human beings are a little different, because we can reflect not only on the nature of reality, but on our moral obligations. This really goes back to that question of whether ethics can be a science. I don't know. One reason that I love to teach ethics is because I've never really made up my mind about the central questions of ethics. Which theory is true of the great normative theories? The meta-ethical question that you ask. Can ethics be a science? I really don't know. I think that science can make the world better. Can it be prescriptive? I'm gonna plead ignorance on that. Because I don't know how to answer that. I really don't know if there are any data that help me to answer that. I can tell you how I feel, I suppose, but that's really it.
Okay,
What a
fair
good
enough.
question. What a good question, though.
Fair enough. Okay, so just before we go, apart from the book, which is again the scientific attitude defending science from denial, fraud, and pseudoscience, where can people find you on the internet?
Okay, I have a website, leemcintire.books.com, and it's got all sorts of information about my upcoming events, especially once the pandemic is over, and other things that I've written. It's got access to my other books. I've got a new book coming out over the summer called How to Talk to a Science Denier. It's available for pre-order, and there's a link on my website. I went out on the road and tried to take, so the scientific attitude lays out this theory for what's special about science and how to use it to push back against science deniers. And then I thought, why am I not doing this? And I did it. I went out and I tried in a practical way not to present evidence to science deniers because some of them don't believe in evidence, but to talk about how they were reasoning about evidence. I was really talking to them about why they didn't have the scientific attitude. And I went to the Flat Earth Convention in November 2018 in Denver, Colorado. And I talked to some people who were climate change deniers and others. And it was unusual work for a philosopher to go out on the road and try to put some of the philosophy in practice. Not just to come up with a criteria of demarcation, which I don't claim the scientific attitude is, but to see if you could use it, to see if there were practical implications for my philosophical theories. And that's what I did, and I wrote about it in How to Talk to a Science Denier. It's unlike any of my other books because it's narrative. It talks about my conversations with these folks. We're not entirely successful. It is very, very hard to convince someone to give up their denialist beliefs. But I think I do have a theory for how it can be done, and other people have done it, just not me yet.
Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward to reading it. So, Dr. McIntyre, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much, and what great questions. I enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. My channel is now more than 3 years old, and to keep it sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pereira Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Viss, Elenian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Usmani, Charlotte Please, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran. And finally, my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.